At 11:58 p.m. on New Year's Eve, while my neighbors popped champagne and shouted countdowns on their balconies, I sat in my apartment with a cup of black coffee, watching the Mathridge Capital back-end hum through its final bonus run of the year. My screen blinked. New email, subject, performance termination. Just 2 sentences signed with a generic HR template. No call, no meeting, no warning, just a digital bullet sent 2 minutes before the new fiscal year when they thought no one would be watching. They assumed I'd be out drinking, celebrating, sleeping. Instead, I was watching every line of code I'd written execute perfectly until they activated the kill switch without realizing it. I didn't flinch. I didn't scream. I just leaned back, clicked into the internal ledger, and refreshed the dashboard. By 12:01 a.m., their Q4 bonus engine published live to investor dashboards. That's when my name showed up under unpaid liabilities, with a line item glowing red, $4.2 million. Before we go deeper, take 2 seconds to like this video and subscribe. It really motivates the team, and 97% of you listening still haven't. Your support helps these stories reach more people. Now, back to Mathridge and the mess they built. To understand why that number appeared, you have to rewind. I'd spent the entire year practically underground, embedded in the finance automation core, writing logic that made their chaotic revenue pipeline look like a Rolex on paper. Bonus disbursements, compliance flags, hedge fund fee waterfall projections. I built those triggers. Quietly. No limelight. No LinkedIn humble brags. Just clean architecture that never broke under pressure. Every executive salary spike, every investor smile. Those came from systems I built while they were too busy smiling for quarterly town halls. I wasn't one of the flashy hires. I didn't belong to their internal wine club. I kept my head down. I liked the work. I liked being the one who made it all tick while they bragged about team synergy over truffle fries. The code was mine. Signature modules running deep in their infrastructure, modular and proprietary. That's what made me dangerous. That's what they forgot when Devian Brisson showed up in July. He showed up like a weather event. Devan was the kind of guy who spoke in buzzwords and interrupted meetings to cite Harvard case studies he barely understood, wore a different suit every day, all 3-piece, made a whole scene out of reinventing processes by dragging interns into rooms he didn't know how to leave. I watched him from the back of the room like you watch a raccoon crawl into a power station. Something was going to explode. He made his intentions clear fast. Trim, legacy, dead weight. That's what he called anyone who'd been there more than a fiscal year. People who'd built things. People like me. He couldn't read my documentation. He didn't understand why the systems had layers of verification. We're over-engineered, he told the CFO. We're too slow, too scared. What he meant was, he wanted control, not stability. By mid-December, I started noticing override requests in the pipeline. Manual ones, sloppy ones, the kind interns make when they're guessing. I traced one back to a temporary folder with an Excel macro named Q-Hour Bonus R Accelerator Final V3 XLSM. It bypassed 3 of my gate systems and rerouted the logic. I flagged it. No response. Then Devin appeared at my desk with 2 interns and that ridiculous smirk. You're slowing down the payout queue, he said, like I was a clogged pipe. We're streamlining. I looked at the macro. It was duct tape over an engine. Who approved this? I asked. We don't need approval to move faster, he said. He didn't know the system was keyed. He didn't know I was the key holder, and he definitely didn't know about the clause I buried years ago during an audit panic, clause 27D. A dormant clause invisible unless triggered by a very specific event. Post-termination execution of my proprietary logic without prior sign-off. It wasn't code, it was contract, and it was active now. While he went home thinking he'd cleared another name off his list, I watched the system interpret his macro as a misuse of protected logic. That's why the number appeared. That's why the internal dashboard screamed liability. And that's why Devan Bresson had no idea he'd just cost the firm $4.2 million with a spreadsheet and a grin. He tried to erase a ghost. Instead, he triggered a mine. It started with a hiccup, barely a flicker in the logs, but I knew my system well enough to hear a cough in its throat. I'd built the payout logic to run like a sealed track. precision tuned, no manual access outside of a dual auth override I personally approved. But in early December, a series of anomalies showed up in the verification ladder. Not critical errors, not enough to flag externally, just tiny shivers in the flow, decimal shifts, bonus timing variances, early queue initiations, stuff that didn't make sense, unless someone was crawling into the engine room with a crowbar. So I flagged it quietly, logged the discrepancies, tagged the internal compliance channel, and pinged the CFO's risk proxy. No response, not even a read receipt. I waited 48 hours. Then the real answer walked right up to my desk, wrapped in a navy suit, 2 brand new interns, and cologne that smelled like entitlement and sandalwood. Devin leaned on my cubicle wall like he owned it. "We're moving a little slow this quarter," he said, eyes scanning my terminal like he understood what he was looking at. "The board wants early bonus visuals. No surprises." I kept my hands on the keyboard. There's a reason the payout queue doesn't finalize until the fiscal boundary hits. It's not a surprise, it's protocol. He smirked like I'd asked for a dictionary. We're bypassing it with a macro. They just need projections, not gospel. The word macro hit me like a siren. A macro on what? He snapped his fingers, and one of the interns held up a USB drive like it was a holy relic. It's just Excel, nothing fancy. Pulls from your endpoint tables, runs the totals, packages them with tax variance buckets. I opened the file from a sandboxed VM. It was a disaster. No checksum controls, no escalation flags, no duplicate ID resolution. The entire thing was coded like a college final project with one energy drink and a prayer. And it had one fatal sin. It directly touched a proprietary endpoint in my payout logic without handshake authentication. "Who signed off on this?" I asked. Devin shrugged. "We're streamlining. We don't have time for 10 levels of approval." I stared at the screen, then at him. "That endpoint is license bound." He blinked, just once. "Meaning?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Devin was the kind of guy who thought license agreements were just long emails written by scared people. He never once considered that the back end he'd been dismissing all year wasn't just code. It was intellectual property under contract, bound not to Matheridge Capital but to me. Built on a personal dev clause the board once approved back when they needed fast help and didn't have time to bicker over terms. Every time my logic executed in a live financial operation, it ran through an embedded tag, ArrowStem LIC27D, harmless, invisible, until you terminated me and then triggered that same logic without clearing the usage path. Then it didn't execute the payout. It reclassified it as an unpaid license obligation. But that moment hadn't come yet. Not officially. For now, I watched him walk away from my desk like a man who just dropped a match and didn't notice the gasoline. Over the next week, I watched the override requests multiply. They weren't fixing the macro. They were making copies, slapping on new tabs, running version after version as they rushed toward their glittering bonus deadline. Every time they hit execute, the system logged it, privately, not flagged, not visible, just quietly noting unauthorized access, unauthorized logic reuse, and unauthorized pre-fiscal triggers. I started my own list, a shadow ledger. Every macro run, every failed checksum, every skipped field. It wasn't vengeance. It was documentation. Because I knew exactly where this was going. They didn't. Then the access request stopped. Devin stopped appearing. My system went silent. That's when I knew they were going to fire me. I didn't panic. I just opened the console, typed in a single line, and hit enter. License audit initialized. Status. Dormant. Trigger. Post-termination execution without clearance flag. Clause 27D, deferred trigger penalty. They thought they were clearing out legacy dead weight. What they were actually doing was running full speed into a clause they never even read. One I built for this exact moment, because I've seen what happens when people like Devin get their hands on systems they don't understand. They treat them like toys, until the toy bites back. There's a special kind of silence that hits when the knife comes from the very hand you built the house with. I wasn't surprised. I was just done pretending I didn't see it coming. At 11:58 p.m., while most people were drunkenly counting down their resolutions, my screen lit up with one last insult disguised as procedure. Subject? performance termination. 2 sentences, 1 attachment, signed with a digital signature from someone in HR I'd never even met. No call, no final meeting, no human decency. Just a legal bullet fired on the last possible second of the fiscal year so they could say it was clean. They thought I'd be out at a party, maybe asleep, maybe already halfway into the next chapter of my life. They didn't know I was watching the bonus pipeline tick like the gears of a clock I personally forged. They didn't know that behind every neat little payout figure and investor dashboard smile was my logic. Recursive, bulletproof, but not blind. I didn't open the email right away. I let it sit for 3 minutes, just stared at the timestamp, the gall of it, the cowardice. 11:58 p.m., December 31st, performance termination. I could practically hear Devin's voice echoing some smug, business is business line over a glass of overpriced scotch. But this wasn't business. This was arrogance trying to erase the one thing it could never replace. Understanding. At 12:01 a.m., I did the one thing I knew they hadn't anticipated. I logged in. The bonus allocation report had gone live, piping data straight into Matheridge's investor portal. Clean UI, big numbers. Record year. All projections tied neatly to the automation core I wrote, except now there was something new. A single entry buried halfway down the ledger in a column no one ever really looked at, because it wasn't supposed to ever show up. Unpaid liabilities, $4.2 million, entity, Keating, reason, unauthorized execution, clause 27D deferred trigger. And just like that, the trap closed. Silently, irreversibly. The clause wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even in the code. It was legal. A retention amendment buried in my onboarding doc from 3 years back when they begged me to stabilize their crumbling bonus system after 3 failed vendors. I'd agreed to fix it under one condition: any execution of my licensed logic post-employment, if done without mutual written release, would trigger a penalty clause, reclassifying all bonus logic touched as proprietary IP misuse. They didn't read it. Or, if they did, they assumed I'd never enforce it, that I'd go quietly. But they didn't just fire me. They fired me and ran the macro. See, Devin didn't realize that his little spreadsheet, his patchwork Excel mess, had directly triggered one of my logic endpoints just seconds after my termination became official. The system recognized it not as a normal bonus run, but as unauthorized post-employment execution of proprietary logic. The moment that happened, the clause 27D trigger activated. And that's why my name wasn't in the former employees tab. It was in the liabilities section, with a value, a timestamp, and a legal trail. They hadn't just dismissed me, they had reclassified me, not as a person, not as staff, but as an asset they didn't pay for. And now the system was flagging it. I stared at the screen for a long time, not out of satisfaction, though I'd be lying if I said it wasn't poetic, but because I knew what came next. The audit triggers, the compliance checks, the cascading data syncs to Sullivan and Gate, their external auditors. The backup files I'd structured to cross-reference every logic call, every license token, every deviation from protocol since Devin started meddling. They thought they ended a contract. What they did was activate a minefield. No alarms, no sirens, just a number on a ledger, red, silent, and undeniable. I took one final screenshot. Not for revenge, just for the record. Because this was no longer a job or a grudge or even a breach. It was a balance sheet entry, and I was the one holding the ledger. By 7:12 a.m., the first finance ticket dropped. Bonus queue stalled, requesting manual override. At 7:14, another. Tax escrow misalignment, Q4 totals off by 11.6%. At 7:21, a third. Compliance flag, logic deviation, potential unauthorized disbursement. They thought it was a bug. Some stale script hiccuping on the year-end rollover. Maybe a version mismatch. IT flagged it as corrupted checksum paths. Legal suspected a deployment issue. They circled the wagons before breakfast. But the system wasn't broken. It was defending itself. Clause 27D wasn't a line of code you could grep through or comment out. It was a legal function nested in logic, a ghost trigger. The moment they fired me and then ran payout logic I'd authored, without a signed release, it flipped the switch. And the system did exactly what it was designed to do: reclassify every downstream disbursement it touched as contingent on unresolved IP licensing. In plain terms, the engine no longer saw bonus payouts. It saw unpaid usage fees. When Devon's macro scraped the logic tree at 12:01 a.m., it didn't just grab data. It passed through an authentication handshake it wasn't cleared for because the user it claimed to be didn't exist anymore. The backend didn't crash. It simply rerouted. Every dollar linked to that logic flow now traced back to one point of origin: me. By 8:09 a.m., the automation console lit up like a Christmas tree. The payouts were queued, but every transaction was held under provisional review. The system couldn't verify proper license clearance for the logic executing those calculations. That's what the message said, over and over. Dozens of transactions stuck in a recursive approval loop with no matching key, because that key was mine, and I was no longer there. Devon, from what I later heard, assumed it was a glitch, told everyone to just run it again. He didn't know that rerunning the macro only triggered deeper classification. By the third attempt, the engine flagged pattern violation, unresolved IP access, escalate to compliance. That wasn't just an alert. That kicked off a structured disclosure sequence, something I'd built 2 years earlier during our internal audit prep phase, when I got tired of legal asking me if we had any latent risk exposures. I built the clause, I built the handler, and I built the documentation trigger to match it. By 9:15 a.m., the compliance officer called IT. By 9:30, legal was running queries, and by 10 darned, a junior associate finally dug deep enough into the deployment repo to see the phrase that should have stopped them cold. Clause 27D, deferred trigger penalty active. Value, $4.2 million. Source, Keating. E, status, asset, unpaid license execution, post-termination. There it was. Not a bug, not a broken script. A bill. I didn't gloat. I didn't even log in to watch it unfold. I went for a walk. Cold air, quiet streets, the kind of morning that makes people pretend things are still okay. Meanwhile, inside Mathridge Capital, a simple clause in a forgotten contract had activated a recursive chokehold that locked their bonus pipeline in place and classified one of their former employees as an unpaid liability, sitting like a hand grenade in the middle of their balance sheet. Everything they ran touched that logic. Every payout, every forecast, every automated tax line. They couldn't delete it. They needed it. They couldn't rewrite it. There wasn't time. And they couldn't undo the trigger because I was no longer authorized to grant clearance. What they didn't understand was that the clause wasn't just about me. It was about control. I'd spent years watching execs like Devin stroll in with their MBAs and their 3-sentence plans, thinking code was magic and engineers were just wiring diagrams with opinions. So I gave them exactly what they wanted, a perfect system that made them look good, right up until they stopped respecting the person who built it. The engine hadn't failed. It had evolved. It knew when to stop listening. And now it was listening only to me. By the time legal found the right document, half the bonus queue was frozen. Auditors were on standby, and Devin was pacing hallways like a man who just realized the fire alarm he'd yanked wasn't fake. They had torn through every folder they could access, digging up NDAs, IP assignments, contractor logs, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain why the payout engine was classifying my name as a $4.2 million liability. At 2:43 p.m., a paralegal finally found it. My original retention agreement. Versioned. Time-stamped. Signed off by the previous CTO and a board proxy, back when Mathridge was still recovering from the internal collapse of their old bonus system. I remember the panic back then, the spreadsheets that didn't match, the compliance risk report that flagged a 3.19 error right before quarterly filing. They called me in on a Thursday. I had a working prototype built by Sunday night. They didn't just need code. They needed a firewall. I gave them one, with terms. And now those terms were staring back at them in black and white. Subclause 27D tucked neatly between the IP licensing appendix and the attribution clause. It wasn't long, just one paragraph. In the event of termination, any subsequent execution of proprietary algorithmic logic authored by the undersigned, without prior written mutual clearance, shall constitute unpaid license utilization, and all resultant financial flows shall be reclassified as outstanding IP dues payable to the original author. That was it. One sentence. Clean, quiet, legally binding. Devin had never read it. Of course he hadn't. He read summaries, he read bullet points, he skimmed change logs for keywords and asked interns to boil it down. But subclause 27D wasn't in any summary. It wasn't in the standard HR exit workflow. It was in a PDF signed 3 years ago when they needed me more than I needed them, and no one ever revised it. Now, because no one updated that agreement, and because no one formally re-cleared use of my logic, the system had done exactly what it was built to do. It saw Devin's macro, saw that it bypassed my license validation path, and assumed the only reasonable explanation, unauthorized post-termination access. So it flagged the logic, and the moment it flagged, it reclassified every dollar touched downstream as IP usage dues. And that reclassification? It wasn't just cosmetic. It triggered a transactional cascade. Escrow buffers froze, payout ledgers entered audit state, and worst of all, investor-facing dashboards updated in real time, displaying provisional liabilities tied to one name, mine. The board didn't understand the tech, but they understood numbers. And now, those numbers were telling them that firing me created a 7-figure problem they couldn't wish away. They tried blaming IT. They tried blaming compliance. They even, briefly, tried floating the idea that the clause was unenforceable. But the clause wasn't some hidden booby trap. It was a signed agreement, verified, versioned, still on file. And even worse for them, it had been used before. During a previous vendor negotiation, one of their partners had asked about licensing implications tied to automation logic. Legal had cited my clause then as proof the company held clear boundaries on logic attribution. They'd use my clause as a shield. Now it was a sword. Meanwhile, I didn't say a word. I didn't file a claim. I didn't call anyone. I just sat in my apartment, watching the winter sun hit the blinds while my phone buzzed uselessly in the next room. They had the document. They had the timestamp, they had the trigger, and they had no one to blame but themselves. This wasn't revenge, this was architecture. They gave me a problem to solve 3 years ago, and I solved it with permanence. They just forgot that permanence cuts both ways. They thought the damage was internal, a hiccup in the logs, a weird legal clause they could spin into compliance mulch. But by the time the outside world started asking questions, the story was no longer theirs to control. It was mine. On January 2nd, Mathridge's finance team sent out the first of what would become a flurry of internal notices. Disbursement queue misalignment. Tax reconciliation incomplete. Their bonus report had already gone live to investors just after midnight on New Year's, complete with updated projections, payout ratios, and a proud letter from the CEO calling it our most efficient fiscal close to date. The irony burned. But what they didn't realize was that in the time between sending my termination email and running the bonus macro, they had stepped into a minefield of disclosure obligations. Every time they tried to reconcile taxes, the ledger halted. Why? Because the underlying system tagged $4.2 million as contingent asset usage, not labor, not salary, not equity, but unpaid license dues. That's what started the real panic. By January 3rd, Sullivan and Gate, their external audit firm, sent a formal request. Clarify reclassification of line item Keating E, marked License Settlement Pending. Attach corresponding IP clearance documentation. There was none. The only record was the clause I embedded. The only path to resolution was a clearance I never signed, which meant the bonus report was now officially non-reconcilable. In SEC terms, that's poison. An unreconciled financial disclosure tied to unpaid IP usage isn't just a compliance headache, it's a reputational event. It's a question mark next to your executive competence. It's a reason for the institutional investors to pause on Q1 injections. They tried to bury it. Internal calls, Slack channels renamed, tags muted. But the system was built to escalate. They couldn't hide it. The automated reporting protocol I designed years earlier triggered again, this time sending escalation flags to every connected financial instrument using the flagged logic. That included tax filing APIs. That included payroll aggregators. That included a sandboxed SEC audit listener. That last one was intentional. Because while Matheridge scrambled to build a narrative around unverified asset flags, I filed a simple, quiet notice through my LLC, Aerostem Analytics. Title: IP Ownership Reassignment, Active Misclassification of Licensed Logic. Filed January 4th. With Securities and Exchange Commission basis, termination event triggered unauthorized use of proprietary licensed logic in violation of retained asset clause. Asset tagged Keating E value 4.2 and. That wasn't noise, that was documentation. Because I knew Matheridge wouldn't admit fault unless someone outside forced them to. The notice didn't accuse, it just stated fact. That the system they'd filed as internal logic was, per contract, mine. That its execution was done without legal clearance. That the value it created was now in dispute. Publicly. I didn't go to the press. I didn't tweet. I let the paper do the talking, and it worked. By January 6th, I got a message from a former colleague, anonymized, cautious. They're holding emergency calls, trying to contain exposure. CEOs blaming Devin. Devin's blaming legal. Everyone's asking who has the authority to reverse the trigger. They don't realize it's not a toggle. Because it wasn't. The trigger wasn't software. It wasn't a patch. It was the consequence of a contract they ignored, tied to a logic structure they didn't understand, run on a system they didn't own. I was the asset now. And as far as the SEC, the auditors, and every investor spreadsheet was concerned, I wasn't going away until they reconciled that number. $4.2 million and counting. The first call came in at 9:13 a.m. Devin's number, probably expecting me to scream, cry, or plead for some kind of resolution. I didn't answer. A minute later, the CEO tried, then legal, then HR. One by one, each call rolled into voicemail, piling up like unopened bills. I didn't need to talk. My counsel already had. They'd sent a single-page memo, no threats, no spin, just the facts. 14. That's how many of my original modules were still active across Matheridge's live infrastructure. Each one tied to proprietary logic, each one executing on license tokens embedded in the Clause 27D framework. Finance logic, tax harmonization, bonus allocation, deferred equity vesting projections, even the compliance mirroring engine for their investor portal. It was all still mine. At the top of the memo was a timestamp and title, Active Use of Licensed Logic, Undisclosed Continuity Risk. And beneath that, please confirm termination of all residual proprietary logic systems authored under the Aerostem license tree, or authorize a delayed license settlement per the Clause 27D framework. Absent written confirmation by January 14th, each execution event will accrue penalty per Section B. They thought they were done with me. They had no idea I was still in every room. The board received the memo first. Some recognized the structure. Clause 27D had been used in a risk workshop 2 years prior, when they needed to explain why certain logic couldn't be rebuilt quickly. Others had never heard of it. Devin, according to whispers I later heard, dismissed it out loud. "She's bluffing," he said. "It's just language, legalese." But accounting didn't think it was bluff. Not when Sullivan and Gate updated their audit summary to include pending logic verification, 14 modules classified as non-cleared third-party IP. Not when a flagged balance line item named me directly on the investor ledger. Not when one of their institutional shareholders, a fund partner I'd never met, sent a direct inquiry to the board. Why does one individual control 4.2 malwares in undistributed asset line items? Please provide documentation. And just like that, it wasn't a systems issue anymore. It was shareholder risk. The funny part was how calm I felt. I didn't feel vengeful. I didn't feel smug. I just felt still. Because this wasn't noise. This wasn't some HR retaliation saga or a LinkedIn rant with a sob story. This was balance sheet law. Numbers, contracts, triggers, math. They'd built an empire on automation and forgot who wrote the blueprint. Now that blueprint had turned the entire engine into a ledger of accountability. They couldn't erase my name because the system didn't recognize Mathridge as the full owner. It recognized the licensee, and I held the upstream. They thought the logic was theirs because it ran on their machines. But systems don't care about buildings. They care about contracts. So I watched the silence spread. Boardrooms getting colder, Slack channels going quiet, engineers tasked with rewriting what they didn't understand, Devin holding meetings behind locked doors, trying to piece together what he'd activated, how deep the clause went. But it didn't matter anymore, because the truth was simple. If they wanted to resolve it, they had 2 options. Kill everything I'd built and rebuild from scratch in under 7 days, or settle the license like the contract required. Either way, they were finally speaking the only language that ever mattered to them: money. The room was quiet enough to hear the air vents breathe. It was January 9th, 4 business days into chaos, and the audit committee had finally convened in person. No Zoom filters, no avatars, no second screens. Just flesh, sweat, and bad coffee. The kind of meeting where everyone suddenly remembered how fragile reputation was. At 9:05 a.m., the compliance director stood, hands trembling slightly, and read directly from the summary they'd prepared overnight. "Due to the late-night termination of Ms. Keating," he said, eyes flicking up briefly, Clause 27D, as defined in her retention agreement, was activated upon unauthorized post-employment execution of proprietary logic. The system interpreted the macro trigger as license misuse. The result was a $4.2 million accrued asset value, logged under her name and reported across 3 downstream systems. Silence. "Unless this is resolved by January 14th, he continued, voice thinning, we will be required to restate Q4 earnings due to unresolved liability exposure and unverified IP clearance, as flagged by both internal and external audit trails." He folded the paper. That was it. The bomb had been delivered. The chairman, an older man with a face built from granite and golf regrets, leaned back in his chair like someone watching a roof collapse in slow motion. "Who approved her termination?" he asked, the tone flat as bone. He wasn't asking to assign blame, he was confirming where the fault line started. Everyone looked at Devin. He didn't speak right away, probably waiting for someone else to intervene, someone to say, well, technically it was HR, or there was a misunderstanding, or she didn't seem critical. But no one did, because they all knew what mattered now wasn't process. It was signatures. Devin adjusted his jacket, cleared his throat. It was a strategic decision. She hadn't filed a quarterly optimization report since Q2. We assumed her modules were passive infrastructure. I didn't realize she still... "Did you sign off?" the chairman interrupted. Devin paused, nodded once. "Yes." The chairman looked at him for a long moment. Not angry, just done. "Then you signed a liability." Devin's face lost color in real time. His mouth moved like he had another sentence prepared, but nothing came out. The audit committee chair wrote a single word on a legal pad, underlined it, and passed it across the table to the general counsel. No one needed to ask what it said. You're done. The HR lead shrank into her seat. Legal started whispering in corners. The CTO stared at his laptop like it might sprout a solution, but the structure had already collapsed. The liability was real. The trigger was legal. The name was mine. And the only door left for them to escape through was labeled license settlement. I wasn't in the room. I didn't need to be. The architecture was doing what it was designed to do: recognize misuse, log it, escalate it, and make ignoring it impossible. It was quiet, efficient, final. At 9:37 a.m., an external counsel slid a new memo across the table to the board. Title: License Resolution Path. Arrow Stem Clause Execution. Attached was a template agreement: settle, acknowledge license use, pay the 4.2 Mallard in full, and receive permanent clearance. Or reject it and refile Q4 financials under material misstatement. Both options were expensive. One was catastrophic. No one argued. No one tried to spin. That day, every person who once called me non-essential had to sign off on a payout they didn't budget for, to cover a risk they didn't see coming, triggered by a clause they never respected. And I didn't even lift a finger. On January 20th, just after the market closed and investor eyes had drifted to newer headlines, Matheridge filed a quiet amendment to their year-end disclosures. No press release, no internal celebration, just a sterile financial footnote on page 32 of their updated 10K license settlement, $4,200,000 finalized. Recipient: Arrow Stem Analytics, classification, outstanding IP dues resolved. They didn't list my name directly. They didn't have to. The system had done it for them. They paid it, not as severance, not as damages, and not as hush money. They paid it because they had no legal alternative. Clause 27D had flipped a light switch on their most sensitive financial instrument, and it stayed lit until they settled. There were no negotiations, no discounts, no let's be reasonable phone calls. The contract had spoken. The ledger enforced it. And the architecture, in the end, chose me. I made no statement. I gave no interviews, but the message carried anyway. A week later, the Matheridge back-end quietly shifted. Engineers rolled out replacement logic under a temporary build name, and for the first time in nearly 3 years, my original deployment keys went dark. They purged the system, file by file, trigger by trigger. The version logs told the whole story: decommissioned, deprecated, archived. That same week, Arrow Stem Analytics went live. It wasn't flashy. No viral launch, no VC buzz, just a clean platform, modernized from the bones of what I'd once built for them, only now streamlined, independent, and wholly mine. It carried none of their legacy weight. No bonus macros, no bureaucratic rewrites, just logic that ran precisely, transparently, and without apology. And at the very bottom of the screen, in muted gray text under the footer of every page, sat a single line: a whisper, not a roar, built by the woman you fired. There were no gloating emails, no triumphant returns. I didn't need them, because some victories don't come with applause. Some don't even make noise. They land like a ledger closing, like a balance finally reconciled. They had tried to erase me with an email. Instead, they wrote me into their books forever.